Professor Eldad spoke about, raised the question, I should say, is there a moderate Islam? And pointed out, of course, that there are moderate Muslims. One of the most pressing questions that we face in dealing with this problem is not only whether there are moderate Muslims or a moderate Islam, but what effectiveness would they have, or do they have, and what kind of faith can be placed in them in order to deal with this question. In connection with that, the next speaker, Professor John Lewis, has a really extraordinary perspective on these questions as a comprehensive analysis such that I've never seen anywhere else of the effectiveness of, or the significance of Islamic moderation and moderate Muslims, and what kind of strategy Western nations must formulate in the face of the Islamic Jihad threat in general, taking into account whether or not those moderates can be counted upon and to what extent. Professor Davis is a senior research scholar in history and classics at the Social Philosophy and Policy Center and an associate professor of political science at Duke University, as well as an Anthony Fellow for Objectivist Scholarship. He has written several books, including Solon the Thinker, Political Thought in Archaic Athens, and I think that that has given him, his training, his classical training has given him a remarkable and unique perspective on how we can deal with the problem of Islam as a political entity and as a supremacist political entity that would subjugate other societies and political systems under its rule. And so I welcome Professor John Lewis.
Good morning, everyone. I'm deeply honored and privileged to be here, and thank you for being here. I wish to thank those who made my appearance here possible, the Ayn Rand Center for Individual Rights in Washington, and the publication The Objective Standard for support, Boaz Arad of Anaki.com, but most of all, the defenders of Israel for making this venue possible, and the defenders of the West, of truth, of reason, Professor Eldad, Mr. Wilders, and others. Thank you. I make a starting assumption here this morning. My starting assumption that there is a grave threat that has risen in the world. It threatens civilization itself. The threat is real. To pretend it does not exist is delusional. This threat, those behind this threat are waging a physical, intellectual, and cultural war against the values of the Enlightenment and their embodiment in liberal nations. The threat is faced primarily against those nations that support and defend individual rights. Make no mistake about it, individual rights is their target. Now, to this moment, the nations of the Enlightenment, I like to call them Western nations, but they are any nation anywhere who supports and defends individual rights. The nations of the Enlightenment have not had a coherent policy toward this threat. They've approached it in a piecemeal way and consistently undercut themselves in their attempt to recognize this threat and to face it. And there are three main reasons I submit why this is so. The first reason is the philosophy of pragmatism, which has come to dominate political life in America and political life across the world. The philosophy of pragmatism maintains that there are no principles to be understood in the world. That the idea of a comprehensive ideology itself is false. It is the philosophy of the piecemeal. It is the philosophy that says the way to face a threat such as this is to buy off one dictator over here, perhaps put sanctions against this dictator over here, form an alliance with this one over here, maybe even attack that one over there, support this group over here while they're literally shooting at us from this direction. Divides the world in this way and makes a coherent policy impossible. Nevertheless, despite this philosophy, human beings do act by principles. So what principles have we defaulted upon in the absence of a coherent policy against this threat? And this leads to the second reason why the nations of the Enlightenment have undercut themselves. And this is the tenet of multiculturalism. Now, multiculturalism is not the idea that there are many cultures in the world, because that's simply a fact. Multiculturalism is the idea of what we might call cultural egalitarianism, that no culture is superior to another, and that therefore we must constantly set out to demonstrate our recognition of ourselves, constantly set out to demonstrate ourselves as recognizing our own failure and our own worthlessness. It has led Western nations, from the voices of their intellectuals, to consistently undercut themselves in an attempt to prove their own worthlessness. It has therefore elevated the threat into a position, a moral position, that it does not deserve. And there is a third reason why multiculturalism has taken root, a more deeper reason. And this is the ethics of altruism, the ethics of otherism. This has led Western nations to blame themselves for the rise of this threat and to set out to bring values to those posing this threat under the idea that we have ourselves oppressed them, and if we give to others, that we will alleviate this threat. This is the source of the idea that the root cause of terrorism is poverty, something which flies in the face of all evidence. We must recognize these three factors: pragmatism, multiculturalism, and altruism, and the effect that they've had upon us in order to formulate a coherent policy. If we are to survive, we must end these versions of cognitive evasion. These versions of cognitive evasion, and recognize the value that we have ourselves and the nature of the threat facing us. We must recognize ourselves and our own goals and our own values, and must recognize the nature of this threat, and we must commit ourselves to defeat it. Now, a policy is an integrated and explicit identification of a nation's fundamental goals based on its fundamental values, including a general plan of action to achieve those goals, including to defeat threats to them. Thus far, most nations have tried to deal with this threat in a haphazard and uncoordinated way, but this pragmatic, piecemeal approach cannot suffice. The first step, then, to formulating such a policy is cognitive. It is to recognize this threat and to identify it. And Batty Orr here made a very important identification in her naming of the status of subjected peoples under Islam as jihad. She observed that an idea is not fully real to us. We do not fully grasp it, we do not fully understand it, and cannot use it until it has been named. It is vitally important that this threat be named. The threat against us be named. And this threat is Islamic totalitarianism. Islamic totalitarianism. If totalitarianism is difficult to pronounce, call it Islamic totalitarian statism. Now, there is a deep and profound and fundamental conflict between totalitarian statism and the nations of the West. Totalitarian governments set no limits to the power, to the state power. They recognize no division between church and state, no division between private life and public life, no limits to the power of the state. As one of Hitler's henchmen once said, the only German who's an individual in Germany is one who is asleep. There is no limit to where state power can go. So note